Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today I'm going to be jumping in to another discussion video slash what if video, a bit like the Maquis video, though this is less a what ifs and more a case of why not. And you'll know already from the title, we'll be looking today at the Klingons, Star Trek's favourite alien race, the most prolific, and is often favoured as the potential conquerors of the Alpha Quadrant, yet they never seem to pull this off or even come anywhere close, and seem to fall short of their reputation as a brutal and ruthless, I can't say warrior race, who seem to get beaten by literal space hippies. So this video is really inspired by potential history. Germany Can't Win World War II, and it's a two-part video where he debunks a series of what-if scenarios and explains how they actually wouldn't help Germany win World War II, and essentially his main point was Germany couldn't win World War II. So kind of what this is based on, and this is a conversation that has been had, I've had quite a lot with my community, particularly on the members Discord. We've been talking about this a lot. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is going through basically the different eras of Klingon history and looking at their chances of defeating Earth / the Federation. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. So, the first period we'll look at is the 22nd century. That's the fairest starting point when both powers are in space. So, in the 22nd century, there is a tech gap between the human and the Klingon ships. It's in the Klingons' advantage, but it's probably not that big. It doesn't look that big. Enterprise is able to hold its own against a D5 battlecruiser, and it's also able to defeat a bird of prey gunboat. So it's not that much of a tech gap, and it's probably not going to last long if they were to go to war with Earth. You also have the logistical issues of the period. Ships are still very slow, very primitive. The distances are just utterly vast, very spread out. It's very difficult to mount any kind of large-scale conquest. That also brings in the political issues, i.e. the Klingon Chancellor doesn't have that much power in the 22nd century. As it goes on and fades into the 23rd century, power becomes more centralized in the Empire, but plenty of reason to think that in the 22nd century, power more resides in the various great houses and their daimyo or lords, whatever, rather than a centralized authority figure, so they're more likely to do infighting. But that really then brings us to the other issue, which is a lack of motive, either because they're busy with infighting, which is, what the Klingons get up to in their spare time, but actually, particularly in the 22nd century, I've come to realize that the Klingons have far bigger fish to fry than the United Earth, which is really an insignificant, nascent power, because they are busy taking down the Orion Syndicate, which is a continuation, basically, of the ancient Orion empires. If you dig into Beta Canon and look at the Orions and the Rigelians, formed like some ancient empires back in like the 15th century or 10th century, sometime like that, long time ago. And the Orion Syndicate is basically the final form of the Orion empires. It's a big economic umbrella under which most powers reside, apart from the Klingons, and they'll be fighting a war throughout the 21st and 22nd centuries, a series of wars and campaigns to dismantle it, which is how you kind of get to the territorial encroachment in the 23rd century. Now I'm hoping to do a series on that, looking basically Klingons against Orions and that conflict. But my point being, they've got far bigger fish to fry far closer to home, making war against Earth, which is a long way away, with not that much of a tech advantage, and all these other logistical issues and political issues. It's not as easy as you'd think. We now get on to people's favourite, the 4 Years' War. This is their best attempt. We have multiple versions of the 4 Years' War. You, of course, have Axanar, which is very famous, and you also have the original FASA source material. I'll probably do a series on the 4 Years' War. It will be different. It will mix and merge, but it will be different. Particularly the FASA version is too large scale for the 23rd century, like where they've got battles of like close to hundreds of ships. I'm like, that's too much for the 23rd century, you know. Smaller, more, you know, open space engagements. At the start of the 4 Years' War, the Klingons still have a tech advantage. There's a little bit of dispute, and the tech gap is certainly being closed, but the D6, whatever form of D6, but the D6 definitely holds an advantage over its Starfleet contemporary. Starfleet cruisers are good and they're powerful, they're large, but they are not as refined or as high tech as something like the D6, which is a up to the moment design. Well, we know what happens in the 4 Years' War. For starters, logistics become an issue as the Klingons push further and further into Federation space. It's essentially the same problem as the Germans faced in Operation Barbarossa. They launch that initial Blitzkrieg campaign. They destroy multiple Soviet army groups. They think we're winning, we're going forward, but the Soviet armies keep appearing in front of them, and they keep having to push further and further, and are running out of fuel. And it's a similar thing in the 4 Years' War. Federation has a remarkable capacity to build, so even though they're destroying fleets of Federation ships, there's always more waiting for them, slowing them down and consuming their resources and causing attrition. You also have the closing of the tech gap. You know, in Axanar, it's the Constitution and the Ares class. Those close the tech gap with the Klingons and actually overtake the D6 and force them to bring out the D7. In FASA, it's the introduction of phasers and photon torpedoes, essentially getting on the same thing. The Federation takes the tech advantage by the second half of the war and is able to roll back Klingon gains that were essentially again made using a war of maneuver. But when you're dealing with something the size of the Federation, and actually something that's quite decentralized like the Federation, yes, you've got Earth, and that's the political center, but, you know, particularly in this point, you know, this is still only the early half of the 23rd century, you've got Andor, Vulcan, Teleprime, Denobula. You've got all these planets that all have their own pre-existing infrastructure. So capturing Earth is neither here nor there, and the distances are still so great that it's difficult to reach that objective, and a war of maneuver only takes them so far, and ultimately leaves them overextended. Oh boy. I can't really talk about the 4 Years' War without, of course, mentioning the Disco War, as I'll call it, the war that happens in the first season of Discovery Season 1. Suffice it to say that these Klingons are in character and their design completely, radically different. They almost have nothing in common with any other known Klingons that we've ever seen. They have massive, like, even putting aside all the makeup differences, the doctrinal differences are just colossal. They, instead of having, you know, wolf packs of slightly smaller, maneuverable, aggressive battle cruisers, they now have huge, monstrous battleships that appear to basically just be 2D cutouts. It's very difficult to see how that fits in with the Klingons we'll see either side of this, other than, you know, the explanation of, oh, they just had a civil war, left behind their old fleet, and then committed to this new war with these ancient, you know, like 19th century built house ships, which I could see, but then I could not see them winning that war at all, even slightly. I don't understand how the Klingons do so well in that war. I also hate how that war ends. I'll put a link in the description and the comments to Red Letter Media's review of Disco Series 1, because it's funny. I just have a few quotes from Rich Evans, and from the famous Rich Evans. Rich is like, yeah, the Klingons are done. Just Keep that. That's a good quote. I like that. The Klingons are dumb. He's like, and then he's later like, the Federation should be able to destroy the Klingons so easily. Like, it's a coalition of really smart people constantly working on science. The Klingons should have never gotten into space. And particularly these Klingons that we see in Discovery, yeah, because they're also like backward and, you know, ritualistic, especially the Discovery ones. They're so ritualistic and focused on ceremony and tradition that they don't seem practical. Like I say, these look like 19th century Klingons. What are they doing in space, and what are they doing beating Starfleet? So, into more jolly affairs and to more intelligent Klingons, we have the Cold War. Now, we're starting out here with the 60s and 70s period, with your classic original series Klingons. Those Klingons are smart. Like, genuinely, they don't feel like, you know, these dumb, head-butting Viking warriors that we'll see later on. They feel like, basically, they're just a different kind of human. And they're just as smart and intelligent and human as the actual humans. They're just two sides of the same coin. And that's something that's actually in most of the Klingon episodes of original Star Trek does actually come out, is there's a camaraderie there during this Cold War period. So, in this period, the 60s through to the 70s, the D7 gives the Klingons rough parity. Yes, the Constitution is a bit more powerful, but the Klingons plan on having far more D7s. The key thing they know is that in any future war, they need to defeat Federation logistics. That was their big tripping up point in the 4 Years' War. They need to find a way of defeating that. The best way to do so is an alliance with the Romulans, which we do see the overtures to. The Klingons buy some cloaking devices, and the Romulans buy some D7s. It's a little exchange there. And the plan of that war is going to be that the Klingons will attack conventionally, basically in the same way they did before, because that went very well for them. But the Romulans are going to be employing some of their stealth technology, their cloaking technology, get behind Federation lines, disrupt and destroy Federation logistics and shipyards, and essentially destroy the Federation's ability to replace losses. And the Klingons are very confident that if the Romulans can do that for them, then they should be able to destroy all the Federation fleets and Starfleet won't be able to replace the ships. However, there's a problem. And that's that they're trying to ally themselves with the Romulans. It was only 100 years since the Romulan Earth War, so that's all still pretty fresh in their minds, and that really didn't go so great for them, so they're pretty hesitant to go in a large-scale war, and we see that. We also see that there's a lot of internal tensions. Apart from being against the Federation, there's very little that the Romulans and Klingons have in common, and in fact, there's a lot of opposing interests they have. And then you add to that probably this alliance was being deliberately disrupted and subverted by elements of Starfleet intelligence, because if it was successful and the two sides did have the confidence to go through with the plan, yeah, the Federation would have probably lost. So that really then brings us to the second part of the Cold War, which runs through the 80s into the 90s. This is the Klingons' best chance since the 4 Years' War. They've massively expanded and developed their fleet. They have again, kind of imitating the real-life Cold War, where the Soviets, particularly in that latter half, in the 80s, began expanding their conventional capability. They had their 6 days to the Rhine plan, and their idea was to win a limited conventional war in Europe. However, there is a small problem, is that the tech gap begins to expand in the Federation's favour, particularly with the introduction of the Excelsior, and add to the fact that the Klingon B-10 project stalls. The Klingons are left without any next-generation battlecruiser or battleship, and meanwhile the Federation are developing the Excelsior platform. Now, that will take some time, there'll be huge growing pains, and they actually have 10 years in which Excelsior wasn't working properly, but they didn't know that. And Excelsior was pretty scary. While they do have the significant numbers advantage, they're going to need it because of the growth in the tech gap. And you can arguably see that that's an indication of the increasing stagnation within the Empire. If they did go to war, sod's law, the Federation would probably roll out the Excelsior very quickly, get it working, because there's nothing like a good war to give you a kick up the arse. And they get the Excelsior working, and then they get derivatives of it working, like the Yamato class and all the other various, the Andor Mark II, all of these ships, which are very dangerous to the Klingons. It was a good chance, but probably still wouldn't have been great. But it was going to be their best chance. And then, of course, that comes to an end with the economic and ecological devastation of Praxis and the Khitomer Accords, and the Klingons are basically out the running now for quite some time. This then brings us to one of the most widely cited scenarios that's brought up, and one that gives me just as much of a headache as Discovery, and this is the Yesterday's Enterprise War. Here's the problem with that. So in the Yesterday's Enterprise War, it's suggested that the Klingons are beating the Federation, and I'm looking at this and I'm like, how? The Klingons send in that episode 3 cohorts to destroy Enterprise D, and it's like, that's the best they have? I mean, even if we take into account the stuff that might have been in service, so we say the Vocha, maybe something out of Beta Canon like the Boreth, maybe that would help, but you're facing stuff like Galaxies, Nebulas, Challengers, Niagaras, Cheyennes, like very, very capable, advanced, large ships. You really think this kind of stuff is going to help the Klingons? I mean, it didn't in the Prime timeline. In the Prime timeline, the Klingons are incredibly weak during this period. They're the Romulans' favourite punching bag, decimating Klingon outposts just for the fun of it, basically, because they can. You have stuff like the Cavort. That's not great. That's a stopgap. Boreth, I mean, it looks good, but it's not going to help you that much. You have the Vocha, but it's completely outmatched, and I doubt they'll have developed the doctrine around it. It just isn't a good matchup. I can't conceivably see the Klingons winning this war without heavy amounts of Romulan aid, and in fact, I don't even think Romulan aid would do it. I think if the Romulans were aiding this war, it would be just to ensure that both sides destroy each other. The only possible way I could see the Klingons winning this war is doing it over a series of decades, waging a series of limited wars, blitzkrieg campaigns to seize and annex Federation territory. But at some point, I mean, yes, the Federation are space hippies and, peace-loving space hippies, and, you can kind of get away with that with the Federation, but that's only going to work for... The Federation aren't that dumb. Like, I've given them a lot of shtick, but they're not that dumb. They're going to eventually say, oi, stop annexing our territory. And, if they wanted to roll back the gains, well, with Galaxy class and Nebula class ships, against this lot, they definitely could. I really doubt the plausibility of this scenario. I can see ways to make it work, but because this timeline is not that divergent from the Prime timeline, and in the Prime timeline, it's pretty clear that the Klingons are the, third-rate power. So that then brings us to another scenario, basically the Dominion War era, where the Klingons go on an offensive against the Federation. Now, this is much better than Yesterday's Enterprise, much better chances, still not great. Because bear in mind, by this point, yes, the Klingons have the Negvar, they have their new doctrine, but the Federation have got the anti-Borg ships now. So whatever initial gains they're going to make, again, are almost certainly going to be rolled back by that Federation technological advantage, which is substantial at this point. The Klingons don't have anything remotely close to it. Again, their best chance, and perhaps the way it was happening, was, again, a short blitzkrieg campaign, catch the Federation off guard, drive them back, but like I say, those gains would have been temporary at best, and the reason the Federation probably wanted to stop it was not to inflict, was so that they didn't inflict more casualties on the Klingons and make them even weaker. That's probably the main reason why that war was, why they went to assassinate the Changeling, rather than because they were going to lose. So, where does this leave us with the Klingons and their glorious conquest of the Alpha Quadrant? We can see here some endemic problems. Starting somewhere in the 23rd century, we see an increasing level of political and technological stagnation. And that rolls through right to TNG. Really, the Klingons that we see in the Dominion War are probably the last hurrah of their empire before it completely starts to fall apart, as is predicted by Esri, and I can definitely see it. Even as far back as the 22nd century, there's an overemphasis on the warrior caste. And maybe it was because they needed them originally, because they were constantly under attack by bigger, scarier enemies. That structure continues long after it outlives its usefulness, and again contributes to a lack of innovation. And there's just this endemic corruption in their society. For a society that is based around honour, you have a lot of corruption, and that results in a lot of incompetence and just inefficiency. And that's really what gets the Klingons in the end, and really is what is holding them back from becoming genuine conquerors of the Alpha Quadrant. Those are really my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. I'd like to thank my members. We've got Chris Morrison, and then rejoining we've got BOS Domestic Disputes, Adam Bowman, and also welcome to C. Powell, Tully DT, and Stephen Ross. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. It's really appreciated. Don't forget to join us on the Discord. We have a lot of fun conversations, and I'll see you guys on the next video.